Okay, so now we're jumping into chapter 3. And chapter 3 is all about financial statements and ratio analysis. And I want to start off with this concept right here. Ms. Perry and I were talking earlier about how we track our health. One of the things we do is measure our weight. I weigh every morning. Now, do you think I do a better job of controlling my weight than someone who, say, weighs once a month? Yeah, because what happens when I start to see, I know this sounds really geeky, my weight has been trending down for the last 3 days because I've been eating apples for dessert instead of crap. And I feel really good. And that tells me that my change in my diet is actually impacting things. And we're going to see that the same thing is true in business. If you don't by the way, I used to not measure my weight. Have I told you guys I used to weigh like 30 pounds more? Oh yeah, and I've kept it off for 19 years now. So my point to you is this: the more you measure something, the more you pay attention to it. Example, the speed limit here. Why do you guys even drive anything close to the speed limit?
Because we have a speedometer.
Because you have a speedometer. You're a good citizen. Who else?
Fear of the police.
Fear of the police. And we're back to monitoring, right? They're measuring, and so that actually gets managed. Does that make sense? And since gas prices went up, I started paying attention to my gas mileage. And do you think it's gotten better as a result? Yeah, and far fewer people flip me off. So, it's an added benefit right there. Okay, so what gets measured gets managed. And we'll talk some more about that as we roll through here. So the first thing we want to do is talk about why we're interested in this kind of stuff. And the answer is we need to be able to make comparisons. And we're wanting to make comparisons between similar firms at the same time and at the same firm over different periods. And I'll explain to you why that's important. So, for example, I used to work for a small plastics manufacturing concern. And we bought our raw materials in 20 kilogram bags, which is like 55 pounds. And it's because our business was small, our orders were small, everything was small. Now, our competitors across town, a company called Poly One, they were a huge publicly traded company. Now, how did they buy their materials? They bought their materials 40,000 pounds at a time. Tells you, by the way, that's what a rail car holds, 40,000 pounds. It tells you there's a huge difference in the scale between these two operations. Now, my question to you is, would it be fair to look at our sales and compare them to Poly One sales and say, phew, we stink? No. Would it be fair to look at our net income and say we stink? Absolutely not. All these numbers are going to be vastly different. And so what we need to do is have some way to put them in an apples-to-apples comparison where we are comparing them on an even and fair footing. Also, we can see that this can happen over time at a company. So, Apple, last time I checked, the company was worth over, $1 trillion? Was that it? Over $1 trillion? Now, roll back to 1996. Apple's nearly bankrupt. Do you think it was worth nearly $1 trillion then? No, I probably could have bought it with what was in my checking account, right? It was pathetic. And then Steve Jobs came back, and then hallelujah, everything turned around, right? So would it make sense for us to look purely at the net income over at Apple over time and say, wow, the net income's trending up, so they must be doing great? No, maybe. The only reason the net income is trending up is because of this enormous growth in the assets. Maybe they've been growing faster, the company's been growing faster than the profits, which might indicate a problem. So that's why we have to have these abilities for both the same company over time and different companies at the same time. We have to be able to adjust for that. So what's the first and easiest way to get there? We're going to start with something called common size financial statements. Someone please name a financial statement for me.
Income statement.
Income statement, very good. And what was yours? Oh, anyone else?
Balance sheet.
Very good. Those are the two big ones that we're going to talk about, the balance sheet and the income statement. And by the way, if you don't know what those are, you need to watch my Chapter 2 videos. And otherwise, you're going to have a lot of trouble with the Chapter 2 homework, which is homework 2. Okay, now we just got through saying that we can't look at these companies and just compare the different things on the balance sheets or the income statements, so we've got to figure out some way to try to put these on a more even footing. And the way we do that is through creating something called common size financial statements. And the way we're going to do that is by finding one number on each of these financial statements and dividing everything else on there by that number. And so everything basically comes up as a fraction or a percentage of that thing. And for the balance sheet, it's really easy. What do we divide everything by?
Total assets.
Total assets. We divide everything by total assets, and that way everything on that asset side is in percentage of the assets, and so is everything on the liabilities and owner's equity side. So that's real easy. The income statement is a little more difficult because the number that we divide everything by, which we say total sales here, it's basically the top line of the income statement, the money that's flowing in. And it's known by many different names. It could be total sales, total operating revenue, total consulting revenue. There's all sorts of things there. And for retail, instead of saying total sales, we say net sales. Can someone tell me the difference between total sales and net sales?
It's earning after interest and taxes.
Oh, swing and a miss. You're talking about earnings before interest.
Interest and after.
Yeah, okay. So it's sales minus returns. Sales minus returns is net sales.
Oh, yes.
Sales
Oh,
minus
right.
returns is net sales. Now, if I'm selling something like hydrochloric acid, and my manufacturing process is good, how much do you think I have in terms of returns? Almost zero, right? So some products, total sales is perfectly fine. Now let's talk about why net sales is necessary for retail. My wife likes to shop on Amazon. My wife is small for an American, but large for a Chinese person. She's not Chinese, by the way, but it fits into the story. So out there, if you guys have been looking at the clothes on Amazon lately, a lot of them are made in China and sold by Chinese people, right? And so in American sizes, she's small, but in Chinese sizes, she's either extra large, extra large, or extra large, right? But she doesn't know which of those she is. But these clothes have prime and free returns, so what does she do?
Buys all three.
She buys all three, and then what?
She returns what doesn't fit.
Yeah, she returns what doesn't fit, or if she doesn't like it at all, she returns them all. And so at most, she's going to keep 1/3 of the clothes that she orders, unless it's a reorder, right? Something that she really liked that she ordered again. She might return 100%. And so that's why it's so important at retail to look at net sales instead of total sales. Any questions so far? Okay, so let me throw some questions at you here, and you can tell me, and by the way, these are questions you might see on an exam. Number one, what would I divide by to find the common size financial statement value for cost of goods sold? What would I divide by? Where is, first question you got to answer in your head. What statement does cost of goods sold show up on? The income statement. And we divide everything on the income statement by
Total sales.
sales. And so that's your answer. It takes 2 steps of thinking, right? You got to figure out where it is. What if I said deferred taxes? Which one would deferred taxes show up on? It's a little trickier. Where do we find deferred taxes? On the balance sheet, right? And so what are we going to divide those by?
Total assets.
Yeah, total assets, because it's on the balance sheet. And so that's one of the ways that we test this material, other than by having you actually calculate things. Now, do you think those are the only 2 things I might ask you about? No, I'm going to potentially ask you about all of them. So, what do you need to do?
Make sure it's on no sheet.
Make sure it's on the yes, I'm sure you'll keep the note sheet with you forever. Actually, as an MBA person, shouldn't you have in your head some general rough ideas of these things? Yeah. Okay. Now, let's talk about financial ratios. So we've looked at common size financial statements, and they've given us a lot of information. But not necessarily everything we need. For example, if we are going to try to look at how well we are managing our inventory, I will need to obviously look at inventory, which is on which financial statement?
Balance sheet.
Balance sheet. And then I'm going to need to compare that to the sales. Where do sales show up? Income statement. So you're never going to get any sort of measurement of inventory performance, or at least not a very good one, by looking at purely common size financial statements. By the way, I want to click back one and talk about comparisons on the common size financial statements. When I looked at, so let's compare both Americam and Poly One again. If I look at the percentage of debt that is represented by, or percentage of assets represented by debt, that should probably be fairly close between the two firms. But there are some things that the size is going to matter on. Remember I told you that we were buying our materials 55 pounds at a time. They were buying theirs 40,000 pounds at a time. Who do you think was paying more for a pound of plastic? We were. And so our costs of goods sold were always going to be higher as a percentage of our assets than theirs. Nothing we could do about it. So we shouldn't beat ourselves up. That also means that our net income as a percentage of our sales was going to be lower. Nothing we can do about it, so we shouldn't beat ourselves up over that. But we should make sure that's the reason that our net income is a lower percentage than theirs. Does that make sense? Okay. So, let's see. So what are these financial ratios that we're going to talk about? What can they be used for? Well, first of all, competitive analysis. The neat thing with Americam and Poly One, we were privately owned. So we were the only people who had our financial statements. But Poly One was publicly traded. What does that mean? They have to submit to the SEC every quarter.
Audited statements.
Say again?
Audited statements.
Yeah, they're audited financial statements, and so as a result, of course, those get published, and we had a chance to look at their stuff, but they couldn't look at ours. So that was nice for us to be able to do competitive analysis. And then there was the place that I saw it more, and that was internal analysis. Every month, my accountant, a guy named Jack Heffelfinger, not kidding, that's his real name, he would calculate all these ratios for my little business, and we would have a sit down and talk about them. By the way, after the first talk with Jack, I realized what was getting measured, right? By the way, do you think Jack also had the ear of my boss? It was actually my boss's accountant, right? Watching out for us mongrels in the front lines. So I knew after that what got measured. What do you think that did to how I managed the business?
Give you things to focus on.
Yeah, it gave me things to focus on. You know, in the beginning, I'm like, because I'm just an engineer, right? I have no idea what to do. I'm like when you throw a 5-year-old in a car and you give them a slushie, right? No idea and no discipline. But because I now knew what got measured, I knew what I needed to manage. Okay, so that is internal analysis. And then there is external analysis. So who's going to do external analysis? Well, first of all, there are equity analysts. And these are the people that you see putting recommendations on stocks like buy, hold, and sell. Those are the recommendations we typically see. And so these equity analysts are actually going to use these ratios to compare one company to another. And that way, let's say I am an analyst in the natural gas field, I could recommend one manufacturer or one provider of natural gas versus another, simply because I could look at their ratios and tell you which one was being operated more efficiently. And then we have suppliers. Why do you think suppliers care about our financial condition?
Because I want to know if you can pay them.
Yeah, they want to know if we can pay. Now, if we were paying cash for everything we bought, would they care? No. Why do they care then? Yeah, they're extending credit to us. Usually in the U.S., when you buy something from another business, they give you 30, 60, 90 days to pay. They're selling to you on credit. And so if you get that and then you don't pay, that's called default, and it leads to losses at the seller. So they want to be careful about those things. So the suppliers will be looking at these things too. And then when you go down to the bank and ask for a loan, they'll be looking at these things too. Why does the bank care about your financial condition? Same reason, right? They want to get paid back. And the same is true of bond holders. By the way, if you slept through FIN 38600, bonds are another form of debt. They're just money that we've borrowed from people from the general public on fixed terms rather than from a bank. Any questions so far? Okay, now, I want you to think of these different ratios falling into families. And these families, just like the people in your family, these things are related, but they're not identical. So these things are all similar, but not identical. I have a sister and a mom and a dad. We're all similar, but we are not the same person. Even if you're an identical twin, are you the same? No. So some of these might be a little closer than others, but you need to think about them all having their own purpose. And the first one that we're going to look at are the short-term solvency or liquidity measures. What do we mean by short-term in accounting and finance? Where's the breakover point? 1 year. And solvency means basically your ability to pay bills, and so does liquidity in this meaning. There's another liquidity that we say being able to convert something into cash at or near the full market price in a short amount of time. This is when we talk about liquid assets. And so they're sort of related, but here when we talk about liquidity, we're talking about our ability to pay our debts. Now, current ratio. What do you think CA stands for? California?
Current assets.
Current assets. And what do you think current liabilities stand for?
You said it.
Oh, sorry. CL is current liabilities, right? There wasn't a state name with it, so it freaked me out. Okay, so back to the story. Current assets are things that are expected to produce cash within the next year. Current liabilities are things that are expected to consume cash within the next year. Now let me ask you, what do you think is more certain? That our current assets will produce cash in the next year, or that our current liabilities will require cash in the next year? Yeah, the current liabilities, right? Because there are things in the current assets like inventory that might not sell, accounts receivable that might not get collected, right? But you can bet that people will continue to send us bills and expect us to pay them. And the same is true in life. Can you always depend on your paycheck? Hey, I can tell you, as someone who once got fired, you can, right? And so you can't always count on your paycheck, but what could I always count on from my bank or from my mortgage banker? Yeah, the bill. It shows up every month regardless, right? So current liabilities are far more likely to require cash than current assets. Now, all that said, let's assume that they're both equally likely to produce or consume cash. Which would you prefer to have? Current assets that are greater than current liabilities, or current liabilities greater than current assets? Yeah, you want to have your current assets greater than your current liabilities because that says at least you have a fighting chance to pay your bills over the coming year. And so, what kind of value would we be looking for the current ratio? Greater than 1, right? Because if current assets is greater than current liabilities, then we're looking for something greater than 1 out of the current ratio. Now, if that situation isn't working out for you, what you've got to do is go out and raise some additional money to put in the checking account without increasing the current liabilities. So, could I issue more short-term debt to get that money? Would that help?
That'll give you liabilities.
Yeah, it'll give you liability. It'll give you current liabilities, right? And so it's really not going to help the situation. So what we want to do is go out and issue long-term debt or additional shares to get additional equity. So neither one of those things are going to increase our current liabilities. The other thing we could do is go out and sell some assets. If we have some assets that we aren't using, then we could sell them and put the money in the checking account and increase our current assets. By the way, current assets typically we're talking about, so start listing some current assets.
Inventory?
Inventory, very good. What else?
Accounts receivable.
Accounts receivable, what else? Oh, come on, what's the most
Cash,
liquid
just
of all?
cash available.
Yeah, just cash, right? And so that's what's typically involved in current assets. Okay, now let's talk about the quick ratio or acid test. Acid test, and no, for you rave people, that has nothing to do with LSD. Okay, so the acid test it says, hey, wait a minute. Inventory might not sell in the next year. Inventory might not sell in the next year. And I can tell you with certainty that that is true. 1994, we were involved in getting some inventory numbers under control, and so we were going through all of our inventory. We had parts that were only useful in a bottle of pump that was only currently in use in Vietnam. And this was before trade relations got normalized between the US and Vietnam. So we were not allowed to ship those parts to Vietnam. Were those parts ever going to sell? No, but year after year, from 1957 onward, they were on the books, right? And so that's one of the problems with having inventory as part of your short-term solvency or liquidity measure. And so what the quick ratio tries to do is to say, wait a minute, what would happen even if we didn't sell another piece of inventory all year long? Then would we still be able to pay our bills? And so what that does, it takes current assets and subtracts the inventory before dividing by current liabilities. So something that students often get wrong here. So we said that current assets were cash plus accounts receivable plus inventory. And so all that minus inventory, what happens to the inventories? Yeah, they cancel out. And so what you'll see are solutions to problems that say cash plus AR divided by CL. And what students want to do is say that. Wrong. That's subtracting out inventory twice. Don't do that. Don't do that. I guarantee you at least one of you will do that, and then you'll email me, and I will very politely explain this thing one more time, right? Okay, so subtract out the inventory. Now, how can we interpret that? A quick ratio greater than 1 says we can pay all of our bills over the coming year even without selling a single piece of our inventory. So if this thing is greater than 1, we can pay all of our bills over the next year without even selling any of our inventory. Now, at a healthy company, are you going to sell inventory?
Yes.
Absolutely. We just know we're probably not going to sell all of the inventory, right? And so this is a little more conservative. The quick ratio is more conservative than the current ratio. Okay, now let's talk about the cash ratio. The cash ratio just takes cash and divides by current liability. So basically, it's getting rid of accounts receivable and it's getting rid of inventory. And so what does this mean? If it's greater than 1, we can pay all of our bills for the coming year without selling another piece of our inventory and without collecting any of the money owed to us by our customers. If this thing is greater than 1, it means we can pay all of our bills without collecting any of our accounts receivable and without selling any of our inventory. Now, it would be extraordinarily nuts for a company to actually have a cash ratio greater than 1. Because we know we're going to collect at least some of those sales. we know we're going to sell at least some of that inventory. By the way, is it a great idea to sit on a boatload of cash? No, Ms. Wabi, why not?
It's a waste.
It's a waste. You're exactly right. How?
Because you could be putting it back into the company.
Yeah, you could be putting it to a higher use, right? And by the way, who does the cash belong to? The shareholders. And so the shareholders could just put that in their savings account just like you can at the company, right? And so that's not what the shareholders are paying you to do. And if you don't have a good idea of how to put it back into the company, what should you be doing with the cash?
Dividends.
Giving it back to dividends and share repurchases. Give that money back to the shareholders. It was theirs to begin with anyway. Does that make sense? Okay. Sometimes we see companies carrying too much cash, especially if they are still managed by their original founders. Any idea why? Any idea why original founders? Let's talk about Steve Jobs. Did Steve Jobs come from a wealthy family? No. In fact, Steve Jobs was adopted. Adopted by two great working class people with a modest house and a one-car garage where they started Apple, right? Now, do you think the first time that Steve Jobs took his first prototype Apple computer to the bank and showed it to them, they're like, oh yeah, that's gonna be huge. How much money do you want? No. They said, boy, that looks like an orange crate with a bunch of wires in it. What does it do? Right? And then they told him to get lost. And so it's really hard when you're starting up a business to get your hands on capital. And so founders often carry that with them the rest of their lives. So as long as the founder is still in charge of the company, you will still see them carrying way too much money. Apple was an example. Microsoft was an example. Still, they're sitting on too much cash at the time. Now, what happens when a professional manager takes over? Well, professional managers have always worked for big organizations. They've never had trouble raising capital. What do you think happens to cash levels at the company?
Decrease.
Yeah, they're going to decrease. That's human behavior. So, who cares about these measures? Well, suppliers. Why should suppliers care about your ability to meet your short-term obligations? They want their money, and you owe them money on a 30, 60, 90-day term. All of that is within the next year. And of course, any other short-term creditors. Banks may loan you money on the short term in order for you to go out and buy inventory. There are other short-term creditors that we could talk about, but those people are always going to be interested in these short-term measures. Do you think those people give a hoot about your long-term solvency? Now, as long as the short-term is in good shape, they're going to keep loaning you money, but they're going to keep keeping an eye on those short-term measures. And as soon as those go south, what do? Take it.
Pull out.
Yeah, they pull out. I'll give you an example. So back in the day, there was Bed Bath & Beyond and a company called Linens and Things. And I'm guessing the things were the same stuff as the Beyond from Bed Bath & Beyond. Now, Bed Bath & Beyond, which is gasping for breath as I speak, they were at the time the strong one. Linens and Things, their short-term solvency measures started to get low. What do you think their suppliers did? I said, yeah, that's fine, don't worry about it. Just go ahead and send us cash. Now, if their short-term liquidity measures are already low, do you think they have cash? No. So what do? They go to the bank. They're like, hey, can you load us some money? And the bank looks at their long-term solvency stuff and says, no, pal, you've had enough, right? Some of you have been told that before, but not at the bank, right? Okay, so what do you think happened at Linens and Things? By the way, Linens and Things didn't have the cash to send to the suppliers, so what happened to their inventory on the shelves? Yeah, the good stuff sold out. They couldn't replenish it. What's left on the shelves? The cream of the crop, right? It's the bad stuff. And so, how do you think the story ends for Linens and Things? Yeah, bankruptcy. They're gone, right? And there may be some Chinese company that bought the name Linens and Things and is selling Chinese-made linens and things on the web, but you can't walk into a store anymore. Questions? Okay. Now, let's talk about long-term solvency measures. Long-term solvency measures, we're looking at more than a year. And in this case, we have two subfamilies within this. And so the first set, you could think of these as brothers and sisters, leverage measures. And then there are some brothers and sisters within these interest coverage measures. And we can consider these things to be cousins between the two groups. Now, leverage, what does that refer to? Any idea? Yeah, the amount of leverage that you're using is the amount of debt in your capital structure. And we'll talk about why it's leverage here in a little bit. My favorite measure of leverage is the total debt ratio, sometimes just referred to as the debt ratio. So it's a total debt divided by total assets. Now, why would I tell you instead to use total assets minus total equity over total assets? The answer is sometimes students just use long-term debt over total assets, but that would be wrong because it ignores what kinds of liabilities. Yeah, the current liabilities, it ignores them. And so that total assets minus total equity divided by total assets is a way to force you to remember to include the current liabilities. And after all, we know that assets is equal to debt plus equity, so it totally makes sense. Then we have the debt to equity ratio. I personally despise this measure. And here's why I despise this measure. If you have changes in the capital structure, it leads to these nonlinear changes in this measure. For example, if the total debt ratio goes from 50% to 60%, 0.5 to 0.6, that's really only a 20% increase in that measure. But what happens to your debt to equity ratio? Well, it was 1 to 1, and now we're looking at what? 3 over 2. So the debt to equity ratio went to 1.5. So, it went from 1 to 1.5. So it had a 50% increase when the capital structure really only changed, say, 20%. So I hate this number. Why do I teach it to you? Number one, it's used widely for whatever reason. You'll hear analysts on CNBC, and they'll be throwing it around, oh yeah, debt to equity, and you need to know what it means, right? The other thing is really easy to calculate, and we're going to find it useful for the next thing. The next thing is the equity multiplier, and it's just total assets over total equity. But here's something really cool about that. We know that total assets is equal to total equity plus total debt. Can we all agree on that? Okay, now, if I divide all of these things by TE, which is exactly what's going on here with the equity multiplier, what happens to this term? Yeah, it's just 1, right? And so what we see is that the equity multiplier is just 1 plus the debt to equity ratio. The equity multiplier is just 1 plus the debt to equity ratio. And in fact, you may find yourself on an exam and you know you need the equity multiplier to solve this problem, but you don't have it. And what you're going to say is, that bastard, he didn't give me enough to solve the problem. And as soon as those words cross your mind, I want you to think, did he give me the debt to equity ratio? Because if I did, then all you have to do is add 1, and you've got the equity multiplier. By the way, do you think the kind of questions that allow you to get an A in this class on the exam only require 1 step? No. A good A question is going to have at least 3 steps. A good B question is going to have 2 steps. C question, I just want my MBA, that's going to have perhaps 1 step, right? So, yeah, get used to the idea that you're going to have to solve more than one thing per problem. Any questions?
I just want to make sure I have that right. The equity multiplier is equal to 1 plus the debt to equity ratio.
Yep, that's correct. Other questions? Okay, so who's going to care about these things? Well, long-term creditors. And let's talk about each of these in turn. First of all, leverage measures all talk about how much debt you already have in your capital structure. Let's take this down to a real simple situation for you. you have two friends that are otherwise identical, they have the same job, they have the same income, but the difference between these two friends is one of them has a boatload of debt and the other one is debt-free. They both tell you, I'd like to borrow $50. To whom do you loan the money?
The one with no debt.
Yeah, the one with no debt. And the reason is, why?
Credit risk.
Yeah, the one that has a lot of debt is a bigger credit risk. Remember, debt is a fixed claim. There's all these payments they have to make every month. If there's the slightest hiccup in their income, let's say that they're a server at Buffalo Wild Wings, and they have a bad week, and the tips are rotten. And by the way, their other debt is to the credit card company and the bank. Who are they going to stiff? You or the bank? Right, you. And so what happens here is that banks are the same way. They want to make sure that these companies have the ability to pay them back and that a slight hiccup in the firm's cash inflows isn't going to cause them to miss their payment. And so, of course, they would prefer that all of these leverage measures be lower. Let me repeat that. Long-term creditors would prefer for all these leverage measures to be lower. So, lower leverage measures are more appealing to creditors. Those are the people that loan us money. Now, they would prefer that we had no debt at all, but that's not optimal. We know that debt has a tax benefit. Interest is tax deductible, and so it actually lowers our pre-tax income, and that lowers our taxes, and that increases our profit. And so there is a beautiful amount of debt that we would like to have. So you got to balance out here. These creditors are asking me basically to be debt-free, and on the other hand, I know that there's a certain amount of debt that I should be holding. So just because your banker would like for you to be debt-free otherwise doesn't mean that you should be. But that's the direction they want you to be going. They want lower rather than higher. The interest coverage measures are about the company's ability to pay interest over the coming year. Now, let's talk about why firms would, or banks, lenders, would be interested in the ability to pay interest. When you pay back your car loan or your home loan, every payment represents actually two things. What are they? Interest and principal. Principal is paying that money back. But it turns out that a lot of the money that companies borrow doesn't get any sort of principal over the life of it. The principal's all paid back at the end. So as long as the company can make the interest payments, then things are probably okay. Does that make sense? Now, at the end, that huge amount of principal that they owe, do you think they have a bunch of money just laying around that they're going to use to pay that off? How do you think they pay it off?
Loan from other place.
Yeah, they go out and issue new debt. They either sell new bonds or they borrow new money from the bank. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
This is how the United States stays in business, folks. As those 30-year bonds mature, do you think Joe Biden's sitting on a big stack of savings, cash that he's kept, and it's just, no. We're borrowing new money. So let's talk about these interest coverage measures. The first one is the times interest earned, or TIE. That's how you can remember that, times interest earned. And it is EBIT over interest. I'm going to ask Mr. Sadai, what does EBIT stand for?
Earning before interest and taxes.
Yeah, it's earnings before interest and taxes. Now, if that thing's greater than 1, I should be able to pay my interest over the coming year. And you say, wait a minute. I see that it's earnings before interest, so that makes sense. But you got to pay your taxes, except for one thing. We know that interest is tax deductible, right? And so if this thing is exactly 1, how much are you going to be paying in taxes? 0, right? The tax on 0 is 0. That's one of the things they should have told you in accounting. The tax on 0 is 0. Okay. Now, you might say, wait a minute. EBIT already has depreciation subtracted out of it. Do you see that? maybe you don't. Earnings before interest, just take my word for it. Earnings before interest and taxes already has depreciation subtracted out. Depreciation is a non-cash expense. And so we actually have more cash on hand than EBIT would say that we do. And so a less conservative measure would be the cash coverage ratio, which is where we add back that depreciation to EBIT. After all, we didn't pay cash for that expense. So EBIT is short by that amount if we're using it as a measure of cash. Now, notice that this has a very similar name to something else we've already talked about today. We talked about the cash ratio, and now we're talking about the cash coverage ratio. Those are two different things, so please don't get confused.
So, non-cash expenses,
Mhm.
depreciation is one of the main ones.
Yep.
And then deferred taxes.
Yep.
Are there any other ones that we
Those are the big ones.
need, so those are the only ones like we need
Yeah.
to think about?
Well, for this class.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Keep in mind, I'm not an accountant, and so I'm not going to be throwing a bunch of weird picayune stuff at you, right? Picayune means small or trivial. So I'm not going to be throwing that at
I
you.
had to look that up on the homework because I wasn't sure.
You had to
Me
look
too.
up.
Last question.
On the last question
Uh-huh.
was over that, and I had to look it up on the homework because I wasn't sure if anything else
Yes.
was on that.
Very good. You're what we call an autodidact. You taught yourself something new. It's beautiful. In fact, most students in online classes feel that they must be autodidact because a lot of times they end up having to teach themselves. I hope my online class is not like that. Questions? Yes?
So what is the difference between current and cash ratio and cash conversion ratio?
Okay, so the cash ratio, we said was just cash divided by current liabilities, right? And it's a short-term solvency measure. And so that's in the short-term family. Here we're looking at the long-term stuff. And and I know it kind of messes with your head because we're talking about a year's worth of EBIT and a year's worth of interest, so it sounds short-term. But the reason it's actually long-term is because these companies don't end up paying the principal until maybe 10, 15, 30 years down the line. So in the meantime, their ability to meet their interest on their current obligations is what we're interested in. So it's actually a long-term measure. And it's EBIT plus depreciation. We're adding that depreciation back to look at how much cash we have coming in on an annual basis that is available to pay those interest on those debts. Does that make sense? Very good. Okay. Any questions? Okay. Now, let's talk about asset management or turnover measures. And the first one we're going to talk about here is inventory turns. By the way, what does COGS stand for? Cost of goods sold, and we're going to divide by inventory. Now, I want you to notice, if you look on down with receivables turnover, we're actually using sales as our measure of sales and dividing by accounts receivable. Both of these things are measures of sales. The question is, why are we using cost of goods sold and inventory turnover instead of total sales? Any idea?
You're charging me for the amounts.
Yeah, so inventory is recorded at cost. Cost of goods sold is recorded, you might guess from the name, at cost. And so it's an apples to apples measurement here. Now, sometimes you will get into a strategy class and they will do sales divided by inventory. That's just not right. That is not right at all. It's going to be inflated because the sales are at your retail numbers and are at your price, and your inventory is at cost. So you don't want to do that. So what does that number represent? How many times on average do I sell my inventory over the course of a year? By the way, cost of goods sold is in terms of per year, or whatever we're looking at, it's in those terms. So in usually per year. So let's just say per year. Cost of goods sold divided by inventory. Now, if it gets fancy, you may hear average inventory. So how would I find the average inventory? It's really difficult. Beginning inventory plus ending inventory divide by 2. There you go. You didn't even have to get the calculator out for that one, right? Okay, so we're just going to add those, divide by 2, and it's all good. Now, what does that tell us? How many times per year, on average, does our inventory sell? Does that mean every single thing on the shelf sells that many times per year? No. Some of them will be moving very quickly, and some of them may take actually more than a year to sell. And so the turn on that item would actually be less than 1. Okay, now let's assume that our inventory turns are 12. That means on average our items are staying on the shelf for how long? A month. Okay, so we can actually put that into some a formula here. The days sales in inventory is equal to 365 divided by that inventory turns that we just calculated. Where does 365 come from? Days in a year, right? Now, some of you say, wait a minute, what if it's a leap year? We don't worry about that. There's actually 365 and a quarter days in a year. We're not worried about that. Don't worry about it. Okay. Divide by inventory turns. Now, we know if we have 365 over turns, and turns is actually cost of goods divided by inventory, then this thing is actually just inventory divided by cost of goods sold. So I could do that instead of dividing by turns, because multiplying by the inverse is the same as dividing. If you can't remember that, go back and look at the algebra review, please. Okay, so you could do this, or you could just go ahead and calculate the turns first and then plug it in. Either way, I don't care. Okay, any questions so far on inventory turns? By the way, let's take our example here. 365 divided by 12 is what? Roughly?
30.
Yeah, it's 30 to 31, right? And how many days are in a month?
30 to 30.
30 to 30, yeah, typically, right? And so this makes total sense that if you had inventory turns of 12, they'd be on the shelf for 30 days. Now, let's ask this question. What would you prefer? Would you prefer higher inventory turnover or lower inventory turnover? Yeah, you always want higher, because every time I sell those items, I'm getting profit, right? And your inventory is an investment. Keeping inventory on the shelf costs money because I have to spend money to put it there to begin with. And I also have to have a warehouse. I have to make sure that people don't steal this stuff. I have to make sure it doesn't expire or go bad. By the way, more than just food expires. I used to work in the oil field industry, and we had things called elastomers, which you might call rubber stuff. And those things would go on the shelf and go bad. Did you know that tires have an expiration date on them?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're only good for like 5 years. Did you know that? My dad bought some fancy new wheels for his pickup truck like in 1999. And he kept his old tires out in the barn. And then recently he got a flat tire. So you know what he did? He got those old tires out, and I'm like, Dad, that's nuts. I said, look, they've got an expiration date on them. They're only good for 5 years from the date of manufacture, and that is long gone, right? It's like, right? Because you can't convince 81-year-old people of anything. Okay, back to the story. Things can go bad on the shelf. So we would prefer to keep our inventory lower, which would give us a higher cost, or a higher inventory turns, because we're going to keep our cost of goods sold the same. Okay, now, students often want to say, well, there's actually 2 ways to make inventory turns greater. We can lower inventory, or we can increase the cost of goods sold by increasing our sales. Let's talk about how easy it is to manage your sales versus your inventory. Anybody here involved in sales? Do you have 100% luck with your sales?
No.
What do you sell?
Well, mortgages, basically.
Okay. And so you shoot them a rate, right?
Mhm.
And what percentage of them do you think actually end up going with your company?
Out of the people I call, probably like 5%.
5%! Now, let's talk about industrial sales. The first time you go out to meet an industrial sales customer, do you think they're like, oh yeah, your stuff's great. You're a great guy. I'm gonna buy your stuff. No. It was funny. I used to be a salesman. Didn't talk too much about it to my mom. My sister then got into sales long after I got out, and she had just made her first tour of her customers. And my mom says, "Did you sell anything?" And my sister and I busted out laughing. I said, "Mom, it's not like hunting. It's like gardening, right? You got to go out. You got to prepare the soil. You got to fertilize. You got to plant the seed. You got to water, right? And maybe something grows." Now, with that in mind, what's it easier to do? Increase your cost of goods sold or reduce your inventory? Yeah, it's easier to reduce your inventory. And let's talk about how you go about doing that. You can think of your inventory as being a tank full of water. And you've got water coming out, and you've got water coming in. In order to keep the inventory at the same level, what must be true of the amount coming out and the amount going in? They got to be the same, right? So if you want this thing to go down, there's only two ways to do it. You can either reduce the amount that's coming into it, or you can increase the amount that's coming out. How does stuff come out of inventory?
Fire sale.
Oh, okay, so let's just say sales. Let's just say sales. And I just got through telling you that increasing sales a great amount in a short term is not easy without discounts, right? And that's got to hurt our profitability. So, what's easier is to slow down the stuff that's going into inventory. And there are two ways things get into inventory. Either we buy it from someone else, or we make it. We either buy it or we make it. If you're in retail, of course, you're buying everything. If you're in manufacturing, you're doing a mix of those things because you're buying raw material. Sometimes you're buying complete assemblies, right? But you're also making a lot of stuff. Now, what you need to do if you're going to reduce this inventory, which is what I'm going to tell you you've got to do, right? The first thing I would do is look at what is in my inventory that I have too much of. And if it's stuff that I've bought, there's a real simple solution. Stop buying that stuff, right? Stop buying that stuff and let your sales then start to reduce that inventory, that excess inventory. That's the easy thing, is to be able to stop buying stuff. Stop making stuff is a little more difficult. Any ideas why?
Then you have fixed assets that are just sitting there doing nothing.
Oh yeah, I've got fixed assets that are sitting there doing nothing, but more importantly, I've got laborers. Now, you might say, whew, we'll just shut the plant down for a month and lay everybody off. Who comes back at the end of the month?
Nobody.
Oh, no. You'll get some knuckle draggers, mouth breathers, cream of the crop. They'll all be back because after all, they spent the whole time off sleeping on their mom's couch, right? Your good workers, your hard chargers, where are they going to be?
Just found a new job.
Yeah, they found a new job. And so this happened to us in 1994, Duncan, Oklahoma. We have figured out that we had too much in our inventory that was stuff that we had made. And so the only solution was to shut down the plant. But we had the long, dark night of the soul where we said, we can't lay these guys off. And so what did we do? Well, the first week, we had a cleaning party. And everybody, and including me, management, engineering, doesn't matter, everybody, it was all hands on deck, and we were out there, and we had that place scrubbed absolutely clean. You could eat off the floor, though I would not. You could have, right? We got it clean. At the end of the week, we took a snapshot of our inventory, and we said, still too high. Week 2, we paint. We allow them to paint, or actually we would make them paint, but we allow them to choose the color for their machine. By the way, big mistake. Have you ever seen those neighborhoods down along the Gulf Coast, Gulf Coast? They've got all those pastel colors, and That's what our shop looked like. Looked like a bunch of hippies worked there. Anyway, not there's anything wrong with hippies. Anyway, so that was week 2. And then we take a snapshot of our inventory, and at the end of week 2, we still have too much. Well, heck, the place is already clean and is painted within an inch of its life. I mean, short of having the guys start painting murals on the walls, not much we could do. But the good news is, it is Oklahoma, where land is cheap, and so we had lots of area around the plant that had not been properly tended to from a landscaping perspective. And so we bought a bunch of these, have you seen these weed hook things? It's like a blade on the end of a stick. Yeah, pretty cheap, like $12. And we launched an army of manufacturing workers out into the weeds. By the way, I took vacation that week. Not proud of it, but there you go. So, and they actually went out there and chopped weeds. And by the way, this is July in southern Oklahoma. Hotter than hell. Now, I have never seen a group of people, by the way, at the end of the 3rd week, we take the snapshot. Phew, we are finally where we need to be. And we say to everybody on Friday afternoon, come back to work on Monday, we'll be back in the shop. I have never seen a group of people more thrilled to report to work in an air-conditioned factory in all my life, right? It had to be air-conditioned, people would have died in there. Okay, so that's my inventory management advice. Don't try to increase your sales. You're not going to be able to do it in the short term. You've got to do it by reducing your inventory. You can't do it by increasing sales. We just discussed that. You've got to look at whether it was stuff that you bought or stuff that you made, and then you've got to cut back on one or the other of those. But unless it's a long-term problem, don't lay off your workers. Questions? Okay, now let's talk about receivables turnover. How do we get receivables? What do they represent?
Sales on credit.
Yeah, sales on credit. In fact, that top, the numerator should say credit sales. The numerator should say credit sales. And unless I tell you otherwise, though, in an exam, you are to assume that all sales are on credit. And that's basically true for the great majority of American businesses that sell to other businesses. All the sales are on credit. So credit sales does equal sales in most cases, but unless I say otherwise, just assume that the sales are all on credit. Now, sales, we've got here, we said it was at what we sell at, the price we sell at, and so is accounts receivable. So once again, these things match up. And this thing is a measure of, by the way, inventory turns is a measure of how well am I using my inventory to produce sales. This is a measure of how well am I using my accounts receivable to produce sales. And so just like with inventory turns, don't do that to me. Just like with inventory turns, we would prefer this turns measure to be higher. Does that make sense? And so let's talk about what would we even like to be able to get away totally from having accounts receivable? Do you like lending money to your friends, your deadbeat friends, who don't pay interest? No. Accounts receivable is a no-interest loan that we're making to someone else. Does that make sense? And so I prefer not to have that at all. Why do we do it? Why do we offer credit? Yeah, to increase sales. Now, if you are in a market where none of your competitors offer credit, do you need to offer credit? No. But if you want more sales in that market, what do you have to do? You can offer credit. And then, what do your competitors all have to do?
Offer.
Yeah, they have to offer credit too. So in the end, you're all back to where you started, only you're worse off because now you've all offered credit. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, so we would prefer accounts receivable to be smaller if at all possible. So we like this receivables turnover to be higher. And we know if we want to increase those turns, that increasing sales is not the answer. By the way, just write that down. Increasing sales is never the answer, at least in the short term. Increasing sales is never the answer. Increasing sales is never the answer, at least in the short term, because it takes time to grow those relationships. So instead, what are we going to do? We're going to try to get our accounts receivable down. How do you think we're going to do that?
Offering
Okay, we could offer less credit, but if we offer less credit, what's that going to do to our sales? Yeah, it's going to go down. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at those accounts receivable and start looking for people who are past due. What does past due mean?
Not paid.
Yeah, they're late to pay. Remember, we're telling them you've got 30, 60, 90 days, something like that. If they haven't paid during that time, then we need to have a talk with them, and we may end up having to cut them off, right? I was doing some pro bono consulting. What's pro bono mean? Free. Done some free consulting with this local firm, and this was during the financial crisis. And I noticed that their days sales and receivables was going up, up, up. That means that their turns were going down, down, down. And I looked at it, their chart that they had of this, for like 2 seconds. And I turned around and I said, let me guess, you consider your customers to be your friends. They said, yeah, how do you know? I said, because your friends are taking advantage of your relationship to get this interest-free loan from you. Oh man, times are hard. Can't we just, and you go like, oh, okay, right? I said, I don't need more friends. I've got enough friends. What I need are paying customers, which I thought was kind of ironic given that I was doing pro bono consulting, right? Okay, they're like, okay. So how, let me tell you a good story, and it's a true story. You know, some of my stories aren't, but this one is. So I'm at my folks for this Christmas party, and you know, my folks are just all to the earth people. I don't know how they know this guy, but he's the former CFO for a company that is now a Fortune 500 company. But when he was with them to begin with, it was just a small growing concern. And their primary raw material for their operation was steel. And so his primary suppliers were these steel suppliers. And in the early days of the company, he said, I would get these bills in, and it would say, you owe us $1,200, and he would type out, by the way, no computers, right? He types out the check, $1,200, he puts it in the envelope, and he sticks it in his drawer. When do you think he pulls it out and mails it?
89 days.
Okay, so if they're giving us 90 days, the typical student answer would be 89 days, and that would be the, I think, is the correct answer, right? What you should do ethically. But when do you think he actually pulled it out and mailed it?
If it's ADHD, probably never.
Say again?
If it's ADHD, probably
Oh,
never.
okay, so let's stipulate that this person is not, that this person is neurotypical, right? This person is, let's
No,
use the
it's out of
word,
mind, out of sight.
let's use the word normal for lack of a better term, right? So let's assume that they don't have any of these impairments. What do you think?
When they call for it?
Yeah, when they called. When they called. So here's how that conversation would go. Hey Frank, this is Robert from Central Steel. I couldn't help but notice we haven't received your check yet. Could you check to see if that might have gotten lost in your system? Now what's the person really saying? You're late, schmuck, right? Okay, so, and Frank would open up his drawer and look in, and he's like, don't worry about it, check's in the mail. And he would sort out that check, he would take it, and he would drop it in the mail. He said, I did that for 5 years, and only one supplier ever figured it out. He said on day 29, I would get a call from Jim, and Jim would say, hey Frank, time to mail the check. One time, one guy, right? Now, am I telling you that that's the way that you should be? No. And here's the really ironic thing. I'm telling this story in this very classroom, and I have this student sitting right here. And this student actually worked for the same company. Now, I still haven't told you the name of the company, right? This student worked for the same company, and she said, phew, I wish my company was like that. We always just pay stuff when it comes in. What had changed? Back when Frank was running the finance, there were like 5 people and no money. Now it's a Fortune 500 company, and it's the agency problem. These people don't care. They're just like, oh, I'll probably forget if I don't pay it now, so they just go ahead and pay it. Which is, by the way, how I pay my bills. Questions? Okay. So that's how you manage receivables, is you pick up the phone and call them. College buddy of mine, his dad owned a fuel distributorship, sold gasoline to these independent stations throughout northern Arkansas. And he would always go, and they would always have some sad story, and he would always come home and tell his wife these sad stories that these customers had told him to keep from paying their bills. His wife was trying to raise 6 kids on the money that he brought home. Who do you think was incentivized to collect those debts? And so the really tough debts, he didn't even try to go collect himself. He always just sent the wife. She never failed. So there's a lesson to you. Send your wife. Right? She got her eyes on the money. Okay.
My husband couldn't tell you how much we pay anything.
What's that?
My husband couldn't tell you how much we pay anything.
There you go. There's your sound financial thinker. Okay. Now, let's see. What else we got here? And we can do the same thing with day of sales and receivable that we did with inventory turns. If I've got 12 turns in my accounts receivable, it means that people are paying in roughly 30 days. What if I tell you that the day sales and receivable is 59 days? Is that good or bad? How do we know? Unless I tell you the terms that we're giving to our customers, you can't tell me whether that's good or bad. If I tell you we're asking people to pay in 60 days and our day sales and receivable is 59, we're doing great. If we're telling our customers to pay in 30 days and they're paying in 59 days, we stink. Now, students, when I say, how are we going to solve this problem? Sometimes they're like, let's just give them more time to pay. Why is that a bad idea? If they're taking 59 days now to pay when I tell them 30, if I give them 60, what are they going to do? They're going to take even longer, right? 89 days? Maybe they'll even double it. Who knows, right? Does that make sense? I had this guy that worked for me. His name was Ramon. And the first week, Ramon's start time was at 3 o'clock. He shows up at 3:15. I said, Ramon, your start time is 3:15 or 3 o'clock. He says, I've got these kids and my wife doesn't drive and I got to pick these kids up and da-da-da-da. I'm like, okay. I'm trying to be the open-minded, young, idealistic boss, right? So what do? I say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to shorten your lunch hour to 45 minutes and your new start time is 3:15. How's that? He's like, oh, thank you. Okay. What time do you think he came in the next day? 3:30, son of a... Right? Yeah, I ended up having to fire him. Okay. So let's talk about total asset turnover. We're looking at sales divided by total assets. And the way you can think about this is, how well am I using my assets to produce sales? So I'm going to give you an example of 2 different car companies here, Hyundai and Stellantis. What is Stellantis? It sounds like an antacid, right? But it's actually the combination of Fiat, Chrysler, and some other crap car companies. Now, and my apologies to those of you who are driving Chrysler products at this point. I once bought one myself, and that's why I don't buy them anymore. Back to the story. If Hyundai wants to sell more cars, they basically have to build new factories because their factories are running at 100%. Their total asset turnover looks pretty good. Stellantis, on the other hand, they're probably running around 60% capacity. And so what should they be doing? Can they increase their sales in the short term? No. So what do? They need to consolidate their manufacturing into fewer facilities and then sell off those now vacant factories to try to get their assets down. So that's how I'm going to raise that total asset turnover. Not by increasing sales, but by reducing assets. And which assets do I sell? The ones that I'm not using. Questions? Okay, we will start next time talking about profitability measures.